The fleet arrived on a Tuesday. No one on Earth knew that, of course. There was no warning signal, no alien diplomatic transmission, no blip on any radio telescope that anyone had time to interpret before the sky changed. One moment, the stars over the Pacific were where they had always been. The next, they were gone, replaced by the dark underbellies of 400 warships hanging in low orbit like a second horizon, vast and silent and utterly indifferent. Grand Admiral Verksalyun stood at the observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Verdict, and watched the blue world below with the mild curiosity of a man examining a piece of furniture he had no particular interest in buying. He had done this 11,000 times. Not literally. That was the record of the Void Ascendancy, the civilization he served, the empire that had never in its 11,000-year history lost a single world it chose to claim. He himself had pacified 63 planets. This would be 64. His adjutant, a young officer named Kreeth, approached with a data slate. Scan results are complete, Admiral. Dominant species is carbon-based, bipedal, technologically classified as late industrial transitional. No faster-than-light capability. No energy shielding. No orbital defenses of any significance. He paused. They do appear to have split the atom. Verksalyun almost smiled. They all split the atom eventually. It never helps them. He turned from the window. Standard protocol. Broadcast the compliance directive on all frequencies. Give them 6 of their planetary hours. The compliance directive was a document the Ascendancy had refined over millennia. It was, in essence, a very polite description of exactly what would happen if the receiving species did not immediately stand down all military forces, open their planetary surface to landing parties, and accept provisional governance status under the Ascendancy. Every species received it. Every species eventually complied, because the alternative was demonstrated once in orbit, and the memory of a single continent turned to glass tended to focus the mind. The transmission went out. For 4 hours, the responses came in fragmented, overlapping, panicked. Dozens of governments broadcast surrender protocols, appeals for negotiation, religious transmissions, desperate scientific hails. Kreeth translated the summary: widespread panic, partial governmental collapse on 3 major landmasses, military forces standing down in 17 of their largest territorial divisions. Verksalyun nodded slowly. This was normal. This was always how it started. Then, 53 minutes before the deadline, a single transmission cut through all of them. It was not panicked. It was not pleading. It came from a single human voice, female, controlled, speaking in what the translation matrix identified as the planet's most widely distributed language. And it was broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, including several the Ascendancy used internally, which should have been impossible for a pre-FTL civilization to locate. The translation read, "This is General Amara Oseikwame, Commander of the United Nations Emergency Defense Force. We have received your message. We understand what you are. We will not be complying. If you wish to take this world, you are welcome to come down and try." The bridge fell silent. Kreeth looked at the Admiral. "Shall I flag this as a rogue transmission, sir? Possibly a single dissident faction. The data suggests most governments are still signaling surrender." "No." Verksalyun studied the waveform on the display, the clean, unflinching audio signature. There was no tremor in the voice, no catch of fear. He had heard 10,000 species beg for their lives in 100 languages, and he knew what fear sounded like, even translated. This was not it. Mark it as received. Begin landing preparations. He paused, and increased the initial drop force by 30%. It was the first decision. He would later wish he had reconsidered. Below, on the surface of a world that had just been told it had 6 hours to surrender, Amara Oseikwame set down her microphone, looked around the underground command bunker beneath Geneva, and said quietly to the room, "Case Longbow is now active. All units confirm readiness." Every screen lit green. They had been ready for decades. The rest of the galaxy just didn't know it yet. The dropships came in at 400 local time over 3 continents simultaneously. They were designed to inspire paralysis. A single Ascendancy troop carrier was the size of a city block, matte black against the pre-dawn sky, ringed with energy projectors that could level a square kilometer in under 4 seconds. They descended in formation, 60 carriers over North America, 40 over Europe, 70 over Asia, and they came in low and loud, the subsonic pressure wave alone enough to shatter windows for kilometers in every direction. The streets of every major city were empty. Lieutenant Yusuf Adami crouched in the dark of a parking structure in Chicago and watched the nearest carrier settle onto Michigan Avenue through a camera feed on his wrist display. 3 months ago, he had been an infantry platoon commander on his 3rd tour. Now he was part of something that had no official name in any public military registry. Case Longbow had been a classified contingency file since 1962, updated by every generation of military planners since. A document that began with the simple premise that the universe was probably not empty, and that if it wasn't, humanity should have a plan. The plan was not to stand and fight in the open. The Ascendancy soldiers, Verksalyun species, the Keth, tall and gray-skinned with 4 optical sensors arranged in a wide arc around their skulls, deployed from the carriers in textbook formation. Perimeter establishment, sector sweep, civilian location protocol. They were disciplined, professional. They had done this hundreds of times on dozens of worlds, and they moved with the absolute confidence of people who had never been seriously threatened. They had been on the ground for 11 minutes when Adami's unit hit them. It lasted 40 seconds. Shaped charges detonated in the road surface beneath 2 armored vehicles. Precision fire from 3 elevated positions, not to hold ground, but to force the enemy column into a bottleneck already pre-mapped and pre-mined. A drone strike on the communications relay the Keth had just deployed. And then nothing. His unit was gone, melted back into the tunnels, the parking structure, the maintenance corridors that ran beneath the city like a second city no invader had ever thought to map. The Keth column lost 11 soldiers in both vehicles. They fired back for 4 full minutes at empty windows. On 40 other streets in 40 other cities, the same thing happened within the same 60-minute window, coordinated by a command network that ran on fiber optic lines. The Keth scanners couldn't even detect because they were looking for electromagnetic signatures. The Ascendancy had never encountered a civilization that still used cables. In orbit, Verksalyun received the first round of casualty reports and set them aside. Resistance was expected. Coordinated resistance was unusual but not unprecedented. He transmitted the order to begin suppression operations and turned his attention to the larger strategic map. He did not yet understand that there was no larger strategic map, that the entire surface of the planet was the front line, that every building was a potential fortification, every civilian corridor a potential escape route, every human being with military training, and there were hundreds of millions of them. A potential combatant who had been told exactly where to go and what to do and when to stop and when to run. One of his Keth soldiers had been captured in Berlin. Unhurt, simply cut off from his unit and surrounded. The human soldier guarding him was young, barely an adult by Keth standards, and the Keth soldier, confused and shaken in a way he had never been in 6 years of service, asked the question that had been forming since the moment the ambush began. "Why aren't you afraid?" The human looked at him for a moment, then almost smiled, not with cruelty, but with something the Keth soldier couldn't translate. Something ancient and tired and completely, utterly certain. "We are," she said, "we just don't stop." She handed him a canteen of water, then turned back to her post. Outside, the city burned in places and held in others, and somewhere in the dark, 1,000 units were already repositioning for the next strike. They were afraid. Every single one of them was terrified. Their hands shook when the carriers passed overhead. Some of them had been crying when they got their orders. None of them stopped. 32 days into the invasion, The senior analyst aboard the Eternal Verdict submitted a report that Verksalyun read 3 times. He then locked it in his personal archive, told Kreeth to delete the original from the ship's data core, and sat alone in his quarters for 2 hours staring at the wall. Because the report contained a sentence he had never, in 63 campaigns, seen written by any analyst in the Ascendancy military. The sentence read, "Estimated time to planetary pacification, unknown." Not 3 days, not 3 weeks, unknown. The numbers were there in brutal clarity. 32 days of continuous combat operations, 6 major offensive pushes, all repelled, total surface area under stable Ascendancy control, less than 4%, casualty rate, 11 times higher than the campaign average, resupply convoys attacked with captured Ascendancy weapons, communications infrastructure sabotaged faster than it could be rebuilt. And underlying it all, the same pattern repeating in every theater, every climate, every terrain type. Humans would yield ground, fall back, vanish into the landscape, and then return, always at night, always from an unexpected angle, always hitting the thing you had just finished building. Intelligence Officer Thessaly Vorn was the one who had written the report. He was young for his rank, known for what his superiors called an excess of caution and what he called paying attention. He had spent the first week assuming the pattern was coincidence. By week 2, he had begun to feel something he recognized, with some shame, as unease. By week 3, he felt something he had no precedent for in his professional life, genuine fear. He requested access to the Human Digital Archive, the vast, chaotic global network they call the Internet, ostensibly to find psychological pressure points. His clearance was approved without comment. No one thought to question it. Information from a primitive species wasn't considered sensitive. Thessaly Vorn sat down at his terminal at 600 and did not stand up for 19 hours. He read about a battle called Stalingrad, where a city was fought over for 5 months in temperatures that should have killed everyone involved, and neither side stopped. He read about a concept called total war, the deliberate, systematic destruction of an entire civilization's capacity to function, applied by humans to other humans, refined over centuries. He read about guerrilla campaigns that lasted decades, about insurgencies that outlasted empires, about a small island nation that once stood entirely alone against a mechanized continental power for a full year and simply refused, through some alchemical combination of stubbornness and rage and national mythology, to break. He read Sun Tzu. He read Clausewitz. He read a pamphlet called Marine Corps Warfighting and then sat quietly for a very long time. The humans had not merely fought wars. They had studied war. They had written philosophy about it. They had argued about it in universities, in parliaments, in barracks at 3 in the morning. They had built entire academic disciplines around the question of how to defeat an enemy that was stronger than you. Every generation had lost and learned and refined and passed it down, century after century, until the doctrine that Case Longbow had been built on was not the invention of one brilliant general, but the distillation of 10,000 years of getting it wrong and trying again. Thessaly Vorn wrote a second report. The Void Ascendancy, it read, has not invaded a primitive world. It has kicked a hornet's nest that has been training itself to fight, specifically and consciously, for exactly this scenario, for longer than our empire has considered this region of space worth mapping. We do not face a military. We face a civilization that treats warfare as a primary intellectual discipline. I recommend immediate strategic reassessment. He submitted it to Verksalyun and the High Council. Verksalyun read it. Then he called Kreeth in and said quietly that he needed reinforcements, 2 additional fleet groups, the first such request in his career. On the High Council's ship, 1,000 light-years away, a body of 12 beings who had governed half a galaxy for centuries received both reports simultaneously. They deliberated for 40 minutes. Then they sent back a single-line response: pacify the world within 30 planetary days or face formal censure. The Ascendancy does not renegotiate timelines for pre-FTL civilizations. Thessaly Vorn read the response and felt, for the first time, that the outcome of this invasion was not in doubt. He just wasn't sure anymore which side would win. There was a moment, reading the records, when Thessaly Vorn stopped thinking of it as research. He had been tasked with finding the breaking point. Every species had one. The Keth psychologists called it the capitulation threshold, the specific combination of loss, fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness that caused a civilization to functionally collapse its will to resist. The threshold was different for every species, but it always existed. You simply needed to find it and apply sufficient pressure. He had been reading human history for 72 hours. He had found no threshold. He had found instead a pattern that disturbed him more the longer he examined it. Humans, when pushed to the absolute edge of destruction, did not become more compliant. They became more inventive. The historical record was almost tediously consistent. Remove all conventional options, and humans began producing unconventional ones. Cut off their supply lines, and they ate rats and kept fighting. Destroy their cities, and they moved into the rubble and kept fighting. Kill their leaders, and new ones emerged within hours, not appointed, simply assumed, because someone had to and the someone decided it was them. There was an account from the second of their great planetary wars, an account Thessaly Vorn read 3 times because he could not initially accept it as accurate, in which a single city was surrounded, besieged, bombarded continuously for over 800 days. The people inside were reduced to eating wallpaper paste. Hundreds of thousands died. The city did not surrender. He read about a campaign called the Vietnam War, in which a peasant army armed with improvised weapons and tunnels dug by hand fought the most technologically advanced military on the planet to a standstill over 17 years. He read about the Chechen conflicts, about partisan resistance in occupied Europe, about the Irish Republican Army, about countless asymmetric engagements where the materially weaker side refused to concede the logic of its own inferiority. Every other species Thessaly Vorn had studied in his career showed a predictable diminishing curve, resistance declining as losses mounted, hope declining as options closed, until compliance arrived as a relief. Humans showed something different, something that looked in the data almost like spite. He drafted a psychological profile. Under capitulation threshold, he wrote, "No clear threshold identified. Recommend treating as absent." His superior, Fleet Admiral Yenisor, called him in and told him the report was alarmist and would damage morale. Thessaly Vorn pointed out that morale was already damaged because his analysts were working with soldiers who had just spent 30 days losing ground to a civilization that, by all metrics, should have surrendered on day 3. Yenisor told him to rewrite the report with a more optimistic assessment. Thessaly Vorn went back to his terminal and instead wrote something he had never written in 20 years of service, a personal communique to the High Council, bypassing the chain of command entirely. "I am aware this communication is a career-ending action," it began. "I am submitting it anyway because I believe the Ascendancy is about to make a mistake of historical magnitude, and I would rather be court-martialed for honesty than promoted for silence. We have been on this world for 41 days. In that time, humans have repurposed 17 of our destroyed vehicles as fighting platforms, established an underground supply network across 6 landmasses, and based on intercepted communications my team decoded this morning, have made contact with an alien information broker operating in the outer system. They are actively seeking intelligence about us, about our history, about the worlds we have conquered. They are not trying to survive this invasion. They are trying to win it. These are not the same thing. I have never in my career encountered a civilization that understood the distinction so clearly. The Void Ascendancy should withdraw. I recognize this has never been done. I recommend doing it anyway." He sent it. Then he sat back, folded his 4 hands in his lap, and waited for the response. Instead of a response, what arrived was a priority order from Verksalyun. The final, total offensive would begin in 48 hours. All available forces, full orbital support. The humans would be broken within the deadline or the planet would be rendered uninhabitable. On the surface below, General Osaquame received her own intelligence report, the one purchased through the alien broker, the one that told her something about the ascendancy she had not known before. She read it twice. Then she called her senior staff together, and when they were all seated and the room was secured, she said, "We're not just fighting for our lives. We've been fighting for something they're trying to bury, and they know we're about to find it." Keth called it Operation Final Shore. 40,000 soldiers, 300 armored vehicles, full close air support from 2 carrier groups, and orbital bombardment on standby. It was the largest single theater commitment in Ascendancy history. Verksalyun had not wanted it. He had been overruled by a council that had staked its reputation on the 30-day deadline and could not afford a public failure. He watched the assault begin from orbit and felt, for the first time in his career, something he recognized with slow horror as dread. Not because of the scale of the attack, the scale was overwhelming, the force projection unprecedented, but because of what the humans weren't doing. Every model predicted that a force this size, hitting simultaneously across 6 breakthrough points, would trigger a massive defensive response. Every available unit converging to meet the advance, burning themselves out against superior numbers until the line simply broke. The humans weren't converging. They were retreating, steadily, deliberately, drawing the columns forward into terrain that grew narrower and more channeled with every kilometer. Lieutenant Adami, now commanding a combined battalion assembled from the fragments of a dozen shattered units, watched the Keth advance from a ridgeline in what had been northern France and spoke quietly into his radio. "All units, there in the corridor. Confirm readiness." Across 6 continents the responses came back. Green, 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 green. Adami pressed the detonator. What happened next was broadcast on every human communication network still functioning, and later, much later, was reconstructed by Ascendancy historians in precise and painful detail. The lead Keth armored column triggered a minefield of devices that were not conventional explosives. They were directed energy emitters, crude, jury-rigged, built from components scavenged from 17 destroyed Ascendancy vehicles, and assembled by human engineers working in underground workshops with tools that had originally been designed to build cars. They were rough. They were asymmetric. Several of them malfunctioned. Enough of them worked. The front third of the column was destroyed in 11 seconds. The middle section, attempting to maneuver, encountered the second layer, autonomous drone platforms, again built from salvaged components, running targeting algorithms written by a 26-year-old software engineer from Bangalore who had spent the previous month in a bunker with a disassembled Keth fire control unit, and an obsessive refusal to accept that she couldn't understand it. She had understood it. The drones were not sophisticated by Ascendancy standards. They didn't need to be. They just needed to be good enough, right now, against an enemy that had not expected them to exist at all. In 6 theaters simultaneously, the final shore offensive stalled, buckled, and then, for the first time in void Ascendancy history, broke. Not retreated under fire, not pulled back to regroup. Broke, with units calling for extraction, with commanders reporting position losses, with the tactical map on Verksalyun's bridge going from the clean lines of controlled advance to the fractured chaos of a force that had walked into something it hadn't been built to fight. Admiral Kreeth's voice was very quiet. "The 2nd Armored Group is requesting emergency extraction. The 6th is, they're calling it a rout, sir." Verksalyun stood at his window for a long moment. Below, the blue world turned, patient and indifferent, and on its surface, something unprecedented was happening. The void Ascendancy was losing a battle. "Begin withdrawal," he said. "All ground forces return to orbit." The bridge was silent. No one had ever heard those words before. No Keth in living memory had heard them. Kreeth entered the order with fingers that were visibly unsteady, and no one remarked on it. In a bunker 3 meters underground, Amara Osequaim watched the carriers ascending on her screen and felt not triumph, not relief, but a kind of grim, bone-deep calm. They had not won. They had survived long enough for the next phase. She turned to her intelligence officer. "Do we have confirmation on the megastructure coordinates?" "Yes, General. Dr. Vasquez has the access sequence almost complete." "Tell her to work faster." Osequaim studied the ascending fleet on her screen. "They're going to come back angrier. We need what's out there before they do." Object was 1.3 astronomical units from Earth, sitting in the outer reaches of the asteroid belt, and it had been there for approximately 400 million years. Human deep space surveys had cataloged it in 2030, one as an anomalous metallic body, likely artificial, origin unknown. The report had been classified at the highest level and then filed away, because humanity had been somewhat preoccupied in the years that followed with climate migration, resource conflicts, and the slow realization that several of its major coastal cities were going to be underwater by 2100. The universe's ancient mysteries had seemed less urgent than the present ones. Now, as Thessaly Vorn sat in a human bunker in the Swiss Alps, having accomplished the career-ending defection he had been mentally rehearsing for days, he understood exactly why the ascendancy had come to Earth. It was not for the resources. Earth had nothing the ascendancy didn't already have in abundance 100 times over. It was not for the territory. A single occupied world on the edge of explored space was strategically worthless. They had come because their long-range sensors, 11 years ago, had detected the object awakening. Not fully, just a flicker of energy output, a resonance pattern that their oldest records identified with a species that even the ascendancy, in the privacy of its most classified archives, referred to simply as the architects. The civilization that had built the galactic infrastructure the ascendancy had been quietly using for 11,000 years. The civilization that had vanished long before the Keth climbed out of their oceans. The architect technology didn't simply activate. It evaluated. It scanned for certain biological and behavioral signatures. Specifically, Thessaly Vorn explained to the stunned room of human scientists and military staff the signatures of a species that had survived contact with the ascendancy. "They built it as a test," he said. His translator rendered the words in flat, precise English. Or, more precisely, as a key. Every species in the galaxy that encountered the ascendancy either submitted or was eliminated. The architects believed that would change, eventually. They built something that would only open for a species that proved it was capable of refusing to break. A species that had been pushed to the absolute edge and had not fallen off. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had not slept in 31 hours and had the hollow, luminous focus of someone running entirely on adrenaline and conviction, looked up from her workstation. And the ascendancy found out. They discovered the theoretical framework in an archive they conquered 3 centuries ago. They've been hunting for the object ever since. When they found it in your system, Thessaly Vorn paused. The invasion was never about Earth. It was about making sure no species from Earth ever reached that object. They planned to occupy the planet, establish permanent orbital control, and ensure the object remained dormant. Osequaim was quiet for a long moment. Then, what does it do when it opens? "It sends a signal." Thessaly Vorn's translator struggled briefly, then settled. "To every world the ascendancy has conquered, every suppressed civilization, every species that submitted and was absorbed. The signal carries coordinates, resource caches, technology keys, everything a subjugated civilization would need to know that they are not alone, that the cage, as the architects apparently wrote in their core programming, has a door." The silence in the bunker was the specific silence of people recalculating everything they had believed about the war they were fighting. Osequaim broke it. "How long to activate it?" "Dr. Vasquez has the primary sequence," Thessaly Vorn said. "Based on what I know of architect interface protocols, 4 hours, perhaps 5. "Then we have 4 hours." She turned to her communications officer. Get me UNEDF command. We need every asset we have protecting Dr. Vasquez and that bunker. On his flagship above, Verksalyun received a priority transmission from the High Council. It was encoded at the highest classification level, and when he read it, his remaining doubt evaporated. The order was explicit. The compliance strategy was abandoned. Earth was to be rendered lifeless. Full orbital bombardment, continent by continent, was authorized. The object could not be allowed to activate. He read the order. He looked at the blue world below. He thought about the soldier in Berlin asking why she wasn't afraid. He thought about Thessaly Vorn's report. He thought about 63 campaigns and a civilization that had chosen, at every fork in the road, to take the one that led to more power and less conscience. His finger hovered over the authorization panel. He did not press it. He did not know why. He told himself later that it was tactical, that bombardment would take hours, and he wasn't sure it would even work in time. But in the honesty of the moment, standing at the window with his hands suspended over the end of a world, he knew it was something else. Something he didn't have a word for in Keth. Something the humans would have recognized immediately. He was ashamed. Below, the megastructure's first lights came on. At 300 Greenwich Mean Time, 62 days after the invasion began, the sky above Earth filled with ships. Not Ascendancy ships. The Void Ascendancy was already there, 1,000 warships in tight blockade formation, charged weapons ready, waiting for Verksalyun's order to begin the bombardment he still hadn't authorized. The new arrivals came out of what Ascendancy tactical systems registered as empty space, fold points that shouldn't have existed, FTL signatures from drives the Ascendancy hadn't seen in 3 centuries. They came from the dark between stars, from systems long ago marked as pacified and dormant, and there were hundreds of them. Then thousands. A Keth tactical officer looked at his display and said, in a voice he could not quite keep steady, "Admiral, I'm reading drive signatures from Velhari ships. Keth records have them as extinct for 200 years. He looked up. They're not extinct. Verksalyun looked at his tactical map and understood, all at once, and with the absolute clarity of a thing that cannot be unseen, exactly what the architects had built. The signal from the megastructure had not been a general broadcast into empty space. It had been a very specific, very targeted transmission to civilizations that had submitted to the Ascendancy, civilizations that had spent decades or centuries, or in some cases millennia, building hidden infrastructure, hidden fleets, hidden networks, waiting for exactly this moment. Not because they'd known it was coming, because the signal had contained something that made them certain it had. A message in the architect code that their subjugation had never quite managed to fully erase from their cultural memory, that if they were receiving this, a species had survived, that they were not the last ones who had tried to refuse, that the door, as promised, was open. Below, in her bunker, General Osaiquame watched the tactical feed coming in from orbital observation drones and felt a complicated emotion she didn't have time to examine. She had planned for a battle. She had not planned for a revolution. But the training held. The Case Longbow doctrine, built on decades of thinking about how small forces with inferior equipment fought powerful enemies, translated surprisingly, terrifyingly, to space. Earth's refitted ships, armed with cobbled-together Ascendancy technology and flown by pilots who had spent the past 2 months learning by doing, formed the center of the Allied formation. They were not the best ships. They were the ones the other civilizations trusted, because they were the ones that had earned this moment. The battle for Earth's orbit lasted 9 hours. It was not clean. It was not quick. 3 of Earth's 6 refitted carriers were destroyed in the first exchange, and Adami, who had somehow ended up commanding a ground-based anti-orbital battery with a salvaged fire control system, and a crew of 7, spent 6 of those hours unable to tell if they were winning or simply dying more slowly. But the Ascendancy had built its fleet for conquest, not for this. Not for an enemy that outflanked it on every axis simultaneously, that adapted tactics in real time, that communicated in encryption keys the Ascendancy had never broken because they'd been developed in underground bunkers in the previous 2 months. Not for an enemy that had spent 10,000 years learning, specifically, how to fight people who were bigger and better armed. Verksalyun fought. He had no other option, and he was good at what he did, even now, even knowing it was finished. His tactical mind worked with cold precision, preserving what he could, sacrificing what he couldn't. But every maneuver he made was answered. Every gap he tried to create was closed. And behind every ship he destroyed, there were two more, from systems he'd considered pacified, and they were angry in a way that Keth language didn't have adequate words for. At hour 9, the Ascendancy formation broke. Not a withdrawal, not a fighting retreat. The center collapsed under a combined push from the liberated fleet, and the outer wings scattered without central coordination, and the Eternal Verdict, the flagship of the fleet that had never lost, broadcast a cease and desist signal in a frequency no one had heard used for 2,000 years. The frequency the Ascendancy used to signal unconditional surrender. The bridge crew heard it and none of them moved. There was nothing to do. There was nowhere to go. They simply stood and waited. Verksalyun looked out at the tactical map. The Ascendancy positions in red collapsing inward, the Allied positions in colors he didn't have names for holding and tightening, and thought, with a strange, hollow calm, 64. I never made it to 64. Below in Geneva, Osaequame watched the surrender frequency light up on her console and sat down, very carefully in her chair. Her hands were shaking. She put them in her lap where no one could see and breathed, and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of 62 days. Then she picked up her radio and said, UNEDF Command, this is Osaequame. Stand down offensive operations. Begin prisoner protocols. A pause. It's over, pass it on. 1 year later. The tribunal convened on a station in neutral space, a location chosen by the Liberated Species Council because it was equidistant from 12 different systems and belonged to no one. It was a place designed to send a message. What happened here happened to everyone, and everyone would have a voice in it. Thessaly Vorn stood at the witness platform for 4 hours. He spoke about the invasion. He spoke about his reports, the ones that had been ignored, the ones that had been filed away while 63 worlds burned, and a 64th one very nearly did. He spoke about what he had found in the human archives, about what he had understood in that 19-hour reading session, about the conversation he'd had with himself in the silence of his quarters when he realized what the Ascendancy had actually stumbled into. We ran every calculation, he said, and his voice through the translator was very quiet, very even. We calculated resource value, strategic value, resistance probability. We calculated optimal force projection and expected pacification windows. We calculated everything the Ascendancy's 11,000 years of data had taught us to calculate. He paused. We forgot to calculate what they were. What were they? The tribunal chair asked. Thessaly Vorn looked across the chamber. General Amara Osaequame sat in the 3rd row, not in the front, not at the head table, just present, because she had been asked to witness, and she had said yes. She looked back at him with the steady, patient attention he had come to recognize as specifically and distinctly human, the look of someone who had decided they were going to understand something and would wait as long as it took. They were not the strongest species we encountered, Thessaly Vorn said. Not the most advanced, not the most numerous. They were, and I say this as a precise analytical statement and not a compliment, although perhaps it is both, the most relentless. Every calculation we made was built on a universal constant that had held across every civilization we had ever encountered, that there is a point at which any species will accept that it has lost and stop. The humans understood this was a universal constant. They had spent millennia preparing to be the exception to it. He set down his data slate. We did not make a military error on Earth. We made an epistemological one. We assumed that because every other species had broken, that breaking was the nature of species. We were wrong. We paid for it in ways the full accounting will take centuries to complete. The former high counselors, stripped of rank, stripped of authority, facing the full assembly of the Liberated Species Council, sat in their designated positions without speaking. They had been advised by their legal representation to offer no statements. They sat with the rigid dignity of people who have nothing left to hold onto except posture. Verksalyun was not among them. He had negotiated separately, and his negotiation had involved full disclosure of ascendancy tactical systems in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was also in the chamber, on the opposite side from the counselors, in the designated witness section. He had not been asked to testify. He had requested permission to be present. Near the end of the session, as the tribunal prepared to recess, he looked across the chamber, past the diplomatic aides and translation officers and holographic displays, and found Osaquame. She was watching him. She had been watching him for a while. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, a small movement, almost nothing. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded back. It was not forgiveness. It was not alliance. It was something stranger and more durable, the specific acknowledgement that passes between two people who have tried very hard to destroy each other and have come out the other side with a shared understanding of what that costs. It had no name in Keth. It had a few names in human languages, none of them quite right. The newly formed Liberated Worlds Compact invited Earth to join at the close of the tribunal session. The invitation was delivered formally, with ceremony, by the representative of the Velhari. The species' ascendancy records had listed as extinct. Earth's delegate, a former civil rights lawyer from Nairobi named David Ochieng, who had spent the invasion coordinating underground supply networks and had lost 2 children to orbital bombardment, stood up and accepted. Then he added, reading from a prepared statement in a voice that carried clearly across the chamber, "We accept with gratitude and with the intention to be genuinely useful members of this community. We also retain our military." He looked up from the paper. "We hope that is understood. We are not naive about what the universe contains." There was a sound in the chamber that defied easy description. Not laughter exactly, not applause, something warmer. The liberated species, one by one, indicated assent. Outside the station, visible through its main observation port, the solar system hung in cold and ancient light. And at its edge, 1.3 AU out in the dark between the inner planets and the deep, the megastructure pulsed quietly, still transmitting on frequencies that reached across 100 light-years in every direction. Its message had changed. It no longer broadcast a warning about the ascendancy. The architects had built something more elegant than that, a signal that adapted to the truth. Now it said simply, "There is a species at these coordinates. They refused. They are still there. A door is open. Come if you want to know what that means."